This meeting is being recorded.
So we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill's and then what his philosophy is. So can you guys see the slideshow that I'm currently sharing?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just get started. So today we'll be focusing on the idea of John Stuart Mill, higher and lower pleasure, morality and happiness, and on liberty, which is basically a publication that Mill wrote. And if you guys want to review the slides yourself, you can. I posted on Google Classroom, so you can do that as well. So we're just going to go over briefly what John Stuart Mill, his education and his life. So he's basically the godson of Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was the founder of utilitarianism and the person we talked about in the previous class. And his father, James Mill, was a fervent the disciple of Bentham's. So he was a child prodigy. He knew Greek at the age of 4. He knew Latin at the age of 8. And he wrote a history of Roman law at age 10. And he was the godfather to Bertrand Russell. I don't really know if you know him. Lord Russell was a very famous philosopher who in the last century. So basically, he also did a lot of work with advocating a suffrage to women and also the reform of the Irish policy of the British government. And also he advocated for the prosecution of Governor Eyre for the atrocity committed during his administration of Jamaica. So this is kind of what his life was like. But he had a nervous breakdown at age 20. So the question that he asked himself is really that he was very depressed and he was really not seeing any point of living at all, which is quite strange for a prodigy. Maybe not so, but that's kind of the challenge that he was facing. What essentially did happen was that he contemplated suicide multiple times. Um, but later on, it changed when he married a woman that he loved. So that was really what his life was like. And then he gave more thoughts onto what the idea of philosophy would be. And he focuses attention much to that. Um, so if we can see this, really, he is in Mill's philosophy is an extension of utilitarianism, right? It's his philosophy is generally speaking the same as Bentham's. Bentham's philosophy of maximizing utility or happiness in the society is what John Stuart Mill tried to do. But the difference between Mill and Bentham is that Mill tries to justify the idea of utilitarianism um, through really human emotions and so on and so forth. So his general philosophy, as we can see, the word and he chose to say is really the happiness is the sole end of human action. These words are pretty similar to Bentham's. They're not especially special. Um, and then he said, by happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain, and the privation of pleasure, right? So really, I guess the idea of life in Bentham and Mill's view is to seek pleasure over pain. And that is the fundamental principle of his utilitarian logic, or of any utilitarian logic. And then if we move on to the next question, right? When we think about happiness, there are many ways to define happiness. And as to what happiness is what Mill had created a very important contribution. Um, so if we can go over the first thing that he said, that it would be absurd that, well, in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity. The estimation of pleasures should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. Can anybody guess or give me an idea of what Mill is trying to say here as to what's the principle of happiness? You can just dummy yourself and speak. Go ahead.
Quantity is over quality.
Evan, you can go ahead and speak.
Uh, Quantity is greater than quality.
Um, I don't. I think what he's trying to say is not exactly that. I think quality should also be considered in pleasure. Catherine, do you want to say anything?
I think what he means is both are important, but like it really is up to the person themselves to think about it.
Yes, I think that would be generally the idea, right? So if you think about the pleasure that was talked about before in Bentham's case, right? When we talk about Jeremy Bentham, he didn't really specify, happiness, right? So he said pretty much happiness is the same. It doesn't really matter what kind of happiness or the quality of happiness. It matters the quantity, right? While Mill, although his principal philosophy is still utilitarianism, but then he disagreed with Bentham, at least on this section of happiness. Does that make sense to everyone? Just say yes or no in the chat. If not, I'll just keep explaining. Okay, I'll just move on then. And if we keep reading the next section of this excerpt, right? So what is the difference really in pleasure? What makes pleasure more valuable than another? Basically, the idea really is that he said of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or most of all have experience of both, give a decided preference. That is the more desirable pleasure. So can we guess what Bentham is trying to say here? Um, I'm sorry, I just saw the question from Evan that about Governor Eyre. He's not really important. It really is that I think the reason why Mill opposed to specifically the atrocity was because he's more of a naturalist view, and I think that's what his position makes him stand out of the British Parliament, being liberal and all that. But going back to the idea of pleasure, can anybody else paraphrase what Mill is saying? How do we know what kind of pleasure is better than another kind of pleasure? Yes, Evan, that is in the second paragraph. Yes, Catherine is right. So basically, being the person, you have to try the two kind of activities and then decide which one is better, right? So this would not come to be a distinction of persons. You think naturally you would conclude one thing is more has higher quality, or one kind of happiness has more happiness than the other kind. So you think that would, if you have experienced both, you would naturally conclude that. So that would be his principle. Um, so I'm just gonna go ahead and move on to this question that we are going to discuss here. So what do you guys think, according to Mill, is listening to classical music more pleasurable than playing poker? Evan, go ahead.
You have to like uh try them both and then decide.
Yes, but I'm asking what would your answer to that question be, right? Which one do you think would be the one that has more quality, more pleasurable?
It depends on the person.
Yeah, but what do you think? Evan, just what do you think? You know, not thinking about Bentham. Which one do you think would have higher pleasure? So Benjamin said that listening to classical music, since most people can't play poker. Benjamin, can you reason that with us a little more? Tell me what you were thinking and explain your logic a
Well,
little bit more.
if people can't play poker, then they don't exactly experience any pleasure from it.
Okay. Okay. So you think because people can't experience it. Okay. So Evan, why don't you explain your position, and you guys can have a sort of a discussion going on here, because I think it's very important to have that different reasoning here.
So I said poker because a lot of people like it because they win money, but Benjamin in the chat said that you could also lose money. But people like you have a chance of winning money, that's why you like it. And you also know there's a risk. So
Okay, great. Benjamin, what can you say to convince Evan that you happen to be right, right?
People
What?
generally weigh loss is twice the amount as they weigh wins, assuming it's the same amount gained or lost.
well then
Okay.
why would still people play?
Well, that's a good question, Benjamin. Do you want to answer that, or anybody can answer that question if you want?
Because it's addicting.
Okay.
Because
I guess what Evan is trying to say is basically that this is a game of addiction that brings somewhat of a happiness to people, right? Is that correct, Evan? Go
Yeah.
ahead if you want to explain yourself. Um, Benjamin, would that be another reason that people would think that listening to classical music would be better, except that not, just think about let's just not think about it in the sense that Mill is trying to describe it, right? You have to experience both. Let's say if a person experienced both, what would be the reason why they think classical music is more pleasurable than, say, gambling or, you know, playing poker? Benjamin, do you want to answer that?
Well, I mean, I suppose that classical music to many people would be a lot, since most people don't gamble as far as as most people who know how to play poker, I'm pretty sure don't play it. But then again,
Okay.
classical music is is a more reliable way to gain pleasure than poker is.
Yeah, I think Benjamin would have a point here, because if we think about high pleasure, especially in this case, wouldn't high pleasure to be with related to something educational, right? With something a little bit more than just gambling, right? What would you say, Evan?
So what was his point? I cut off.
Oh, no problem. You can explain your point again, Benjamin, if you would
I
like to.
only I heard that something about education.
Okay. I was just saying that I think the question here about gambling, why that I personally think it wouldn't be the one that has more pleasure, is because the purpose of playing poker is not as noble as playing classical music. Does that make sense? And also, basically, I would think, generally speaking, classical music is a healthier type of activity than gambling.
So if you say that classical music is more healthier, then it might be, but then some people like nowadays, for example, will say that like why do we still play poker? Well, and they already know that there's a risk of losing money and they're not learning anything from it. So or I don't really know.
Okay. I mean, the question in philosophy is that we never know sometimes, right? I think Evan's touching on a point in which he is trying to say that if people happen to like poker so much, why do we distinguish there, being a higher and lower pleasure, right? Why don't we just say that because people like it more, if they tried both, if they like it more, then it would naturally be poker rather than, I guess, in this case, music, or listening to classical music in this case.
If you don't play classical music, why would you listen to it? You may like it, but you may think it's useless for you to spend your time on listening to something that
We're
you.
getting a little bit far off here. Catherine, do you want to explain what is your point here?
I don't have a very strong opinion on this, but in terms of pleasure, I feel like listening to music is a form of like educational pleasure, or like the like simple pleasure you get from listening to whatever you want. And then in terms of gambling or poker, if it's not for the pleasure of playing the game, it's likely for the pleasure of monetary gain. So
Okay,
it's not, then the pleasure is not really about poker, but it's about money. So yeah.
I see. So I think Catherine makes a distinction between the kind of pleasure that you would get, right? One that has a more noble intrinsic value, and the other one being merely monetary, right? I guess Mill would probably say it would be classical music in his mind, but I guess the question to us is really, we have to think about it. At least we know how to think about it through what Mill's philosophy and through his philosophy and through his thinking. And of course, we might get different results out of it because we're very different people. But again, I'll just move on to the next slide and talk about what is Mill's idea on morality. So if we go through the first sentence, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So from this sentence, we see really an outright utilitarian, right? This is a generalized principle followed by every utilitarian, right? The question here, I guess, the question of anything in utilitarian philosophy is how do you determine, or what is the kind of the general premise of happiness, and how do we maximize it, and through what ways can we maximize it? And if we go through the second question, the principle of his that he stated, I think it's a bit more clear, right? Um, it is not good that persons should be bound by other people's opinion to do everything that they would deserve praise for doing. There is a standard of altruism to which all should be required to come up, and a degree beyond it which is not obligatory but meritorious. So, can anybody just say what they think Mill is trying to speak about? Um, Go ahead, Catherine.
I feel like he's employing like a certain standard at which a human being needs to be morally obligated for before anything else they do comes up to be um like go above and beyond. And then in terms of like the last paragraph, I feel like it's more of like it slightly contradicts his previous statement because first of all he says that everybody should have a moral obligation, and in the third paragraph he says that it depends on the person who like that can have their own values or views on the world, and they can decide what moral obligation someone should have. So yeah.
So Evan, do you want to say anything more about that?
So are you talking about the first paragraph or the second one?
You can go ahead with the second one.
Okay, so the second one is saying that to be a person you shouldn't be completely affected by other people's opinions, and also you should like to extent to listen to them but not fully listen to them, and um if you're above like completely affected by another person's opinions, it's very meritorious, which is just excessive.
Right. I think I think Catherine is pretty correct on this as to what Mill is trying to say, right? Mill is basically trying to say that we must, I guess what he's trying to say is really, it would be better if everyone has a level of altruism, right? To really do above and beyond on their duties. But he know that is not the practical thinking, right? So what the practical thinking between right and wrong lies on the idea of punishment, right? And to what extent that people should be punished, and that is really the line between right and wrong, is whether or not people ought to be punished by it. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see that we do not call anything wrong unless we mean to imply that a person ought to be punished in some way, right? So a person might be, say, caught between the lines, right? He did not do above and beyond, but he's not necessarily wrong because he didn't do above and beyond, right? So unless we do something, morally wrong, then the person would be proper to be blamed for that moral wrong. And the question really is that it's really vague, right? What do we know specifically that can determine what is right and wrong, and what is going above and beyond, and what people ought to do and what people should do? So, giving the context that Mill is utilitarian, the idea of conducting moral wrong should be emphasized on the idea of utilitarian um, logic, right? Whether or not the act is diminishing the overall happiness of a society, right? So if they do that, if they do produce certain level of things that decrease the overall really productivity or utility of society, then they are doing something morally wrong. Um, does that make sense? Or do you guys think there's a different way of understanding this? Go ahead if you guys have anything to say. Okay. So here I think we're just going to move on to the next slide. And I want you guys to think about this question. I want to think about really the suffrage movement and also whether or not people should get to vote, right? Should people have the right to vote, and why? Or why not? According to Mill's logic here, right? So let's think about this in a different way. Let's think about this in a cost and benefit analysis, right? So if we don't get the vote, if some people don't get to vote, what's the benefit? If they do get to vote, what's the benefit? The same question, really. And can anybody say, anything on that topic? It's really theoretical. We don't really have to get into whether or not you believe in it. But what would some of the arguments be here as to why some people shouldn't be able to vote?
Well, technically, if one party has a majority advantage, then then it would be theoretically better for, like, just let's say the country that they were in, or only say the party that had the advantage to vote, because it'd bring benefits to more people.
Right. So, Benjamin, I'm just going to go a little bit further on this, right? You were saying that if you have a majority in a country, and if they do vote, it will be better for the rest of us, right? Is that what you're getting at? That way, you would maximize the utility in the country.
Oh, no,
Is that correct?
technically, when you want to maximize it. If there is a majority in the country, then let's say that perhaps, I mean, this is kind of hard. The moral sense here is a little fuzzy, and the utilitarian sense is also fuzzy. But if there's a huge majority in the country, then potentially it'd be better for only the majority to be allowed to vote.
Because they would reach a consensus on things, right? And then they would get a result, a considerable, I guess, benefit for the most of the population. Is that correct? Is that
Yes.
what you're saying, Benjamin?
Yes. It's on the other hand, it's sort of fuzzy here, since technically if there's a majority, then they would have control over the political system anyways, but
Okay.
But isn't that like excluding other people, technically?
I think we have to focus a little bit less on the moral side of this, right? The reason being is that utilitarian logic at least, is itself a distinctive way of moral thinking. So here we shouldn't be concerned about really what is the right thing to do or what is the wrong thing to do, but what is the right thing to do in a utilitarian logic, right? So if the question that was raised about majority and minority, in this case specifically, let me just give you an example, right? So if the majority of people happen to be, say, let's use the example of England, right? There's men get to vote and women don't get to vote, right? So we think about this principle of happiness. And I think there's two ways about it, right? The one way is to say that because of the majority are men and they're benefiting from their current policy, their happiness would be overall more important than women's happiness. So therefore, the women should not get the vote because they might have a different opinion. And if their opinion are different, that might influence the overall happiness of men. So that's one way to think about it in a utilitarian logic. Just trying to use an example here to illustrate more or less what's kind of the analysis that we're using. for this question. You guys can go ahead with what you were going to say, Evan, and Catherine and Benjamin, if you want to say anything. Go ahead. If not, I'm just going to move on to what his answer, at least Mo's answer to this question would be. I guess I'll just move on then. So the question really that in his mind, what are the things to be said is really on two grounds, right? So one is really that interest of different parties are underrepresented. They're not really represented in any way in the parliament, and that would cause frustration for these people, right? So if women don't get to vote, they won't have representation in Congress, right? So they won't have policy that favors their circumstance, and they will be very frustrated by that. And the second really objection is really to deny individual life, right? Individuals of the opportunity of participating in public political discourse is to deny them a good and happy life. So what he's essentially saying is that we add these two reasons together and we put it in numbers, we would see that if we do give people the right to vote, if we do not give them the right to vote in this case, that it would not maximize the happiness, the overall happiness of the society, right? But if you do give them the opportunity to vote, these two questions, at least two grounds for objection will not be there. And if that happens, you would have a different case. So does that make sense to everyone, what I'm trying to say here? As to what reason that he's trying to object to, and what the principal objection that he made as to why people should be able to vote. So as we see, the reasoning is very different from what we would think in some circumstance. But if you all happen to be utilitarian, you essentially might have different results as to how you analyze things and so on and so forth. So we're just going to move on to the last part of our discussion, and we're going to talk about the book on liberty today. So can anyone tell me from the first idea, the first paragraph on slide 11, what is kind of the idea of that section? Anybody want to say anything? If
Is it like each person they care about their self-protection first, or
I think the idea here is more or less, if we think about the idea of liberty, right? So if we really want to interfere with liberty, for anybody's liberty, it would only be because of self-protection. That is the only thing that warrants the fundamental idea of basically interfering with liberty. So we only interfere with liberty or anybody else's liberty when we need to protect ourselves, when we need to take that measure to protect ourselves. And if we go through the second question here, Mill is trying to say that basically we use this is how he determines things, right? We say that P, or basically one public opinion, is true, false, or partially true. He thinks that P's assertion, it doesn't really matter really what the public opinion is. He thinks that the idea of any public opinion should be welcomed because they will be useful for discovering and maintaining the truth. And then we move on to the second, the slide 12, we will go a bit more into that, right? So essentially in his book, he raised a lot of example of, things that happen to be suppressed because they were thought to be false, but they happen to be true. So he thinks that really, if we assume that would be the case, it would not really be fair. And he thinks that we should not really use this kind of distinction to determine one thing or another. So really, the idea here he is trying to say in so many ways is to argue that when one thing, a view is trying to be is harmful, and then really to basically, I think one thing is to say that a view is harmful and then we try to suppress it, or really we allow debate to really those questions, right? So I think even though he thinks that if belief is false, that anything in that discussion, in that public discussion, is really productive in really finding out as to what the truth are. So that's why you should not suppress anything at all. So the assertion of false opinions will lead to a vigorous debate. And then if we really don't do that, the results will be worse if we don't even have really a free and public debate on these issues. As we can see in his writing, that however unwilling a person who has a strong opinion may admit the possibility that his opinion may be false, he ought to be moved by the consideration that however true it may be, if it is not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, it will be held as the dead dogma, not a living truth. So here we really want to stress a bit more, at least he's trying to stress a little bit more as to why we should have public opinion, because if we do have open discussions about these things, he thinks the truth will be evident. Does anybody see a problem with his thinking on public debates, or whether or not we should have them?
People may not speak the truth.
Go ahead, Evan, if you want to say anything.
People may not say the truth of their feelings during a debate.
Okay. So there's a fear of public pleasure. There's a fear of peer pressure. Is that what you're getting at, Evan? Because of what society believes in, that might be different than his personal opinion?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have another objection to that?
Only people who have the opinions that only people who the opinion strongly concerns will really take part in the public debate.
Okay. So another concern is that we're worried about what specifically here, whether or not the people's opinion are really in ways represented, right? If you don't care enough about the issue, you won't really raise a public opinion about it. And I guess I would also have plenty of objection, right? If there is such a thing called immense propaganda, I think it's possible that people may very much believe in that false belief. And I don't know if the case for open public debate will be able to solve that, right? But I think it really depends on what the circumstance is. But we do see there being, I guess, more or less problematic understanding, at least partially problematic view, because I guess more or less because of the reasoning, and from that reasoning, especially the result that he came to. So I think this is all we have as of today. Do you guys have any more questions that I can answer? If not, we'll just end our meeting here and now. All right, then I guess I would just like to thank you very much for taking this meeting, and I wish you all have a great day. And thank you so much for taking this class. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.